at any successful company, whatever the market or whatever the country, what you'll find is that 9 times out of 10, the success of that company is based on the success of brands. Now, you've just seen very quickly about 100 brands like this. Not just brands of soap or soup or toothpaste or washing powder, but also brands of unit trust, transport, recording company, hotel, and dozens of others. And every one of them, we think, has something that a mere product hasn't got.
Brands like this have been contributing to the success of companies now for the best part of a century. But today, they're under attack on all sides, or so it seems. A few people are even beginning to ask whether brands are in consumers' interests at all. Manufacturers are facing new problems. There's the growing power of the bigger retail chains, the rise and importance of private label products, the vulnerability of the third and fourth brand in any market, and the ever-growing proportion of marketing funds that's being allocated to promotional and below-the-line activities. So, in the face of all these new pressures, what sort of future does the manufacturer's brand have?
What we're trying to do in this film is to see just how new this situation really is, how serious it is, and what should be done about it. We've looked at it from 3 points of view. First of all, is it new at all? What can we learn from the history of brands? Secondly, what is it that makes a brand successful? And thirdly, what can manufacturers do to keep their brands successful? In particular, what in these circumstances is the role that advertising should play?
We found it helpful in trying to answer some of these questions to look first at the whole way in which brands developed. Now, we've taken the UK as an example because obviously we know it best, and although the pattern may have been slightly different in other countries, we believe that the principles to have been the same. So let's start by going backwards to the end of the 19th century. It was at about this time that brands first began to emerge. And the dominating force was not the manufacturer, not the retailer, and certainly not the consumer. It was the wholesaler. The wholesaler would specify to the manufacturer what sort of, say, mincer he should make, and what's more, would ask for a price from more than one manufacturer. So the manufacturer's profit depended almost entirely on sheer production efficiency. There was virtually no scope for building up margins by providing a unique product. And the retailer, of course, had no choice but to buy the mincer the wholesaler stocked. The manufacturer, therefore, was 2 stages removed from the ultimate consumer. It was virtually commodity marketing. Then, gradually, manufactured products became more complicated. And with the benefits of large-scale production becoming ever more apparent, the need arose to invest large sums of money in new and expensive plant. In a competitive tender situation, this put the manufacturer at very considerable risk. So he was forced to overcome the problem through the use of patents. Instead of simply making mincers to order, he made a unique product, Smithers' patent self-reversing mincer, a privilege denied by law to his competitors. And then, again gradually, the practice of using brand names spread to other unique but non-patented goods and products. This naturally resulted in a strengthening of the manufacturer's position, at least of the inventive and the efficient ones, which was, of course, fiercely opposed by wholesalers, who found their bargaining power correspondingly weakened. The next move by the manufacturers to safeguard their new strength was by applying pressure on the wholesaler from the other end. They began to talk of their brands directly to the buying public. They began to advertise. So the buying public began to trust certain named brands and to ask for them at their shops. And the shops had to order them from the wholesalers. And the wholesalers, if they were themselves to survive, had to buy them from the only manufacturer making them.
So there began a period of manufacturer domination based on unique products and direct communication with consumers, a period that lasted in the UK from about 1900 to about the 1960s. While markets grew, the number of manufacturers in them was drastically reduced, from hundreds or even thousands in some product fields to the sort of oligopoly situation that we see so often today. And the basis of these growing manufacturers' growing profits became economies of scale in production, raw material purchasing, distribution, investment capital, and so on. And in keeping with this, the role of advertising changed. It was now seen as one of promoting growth, regular increases in sales volume. The original role of stabilizing demand became rather taken for granted. One key factor throughout this period was that manufacturers could control their consumer prices with the full backing of the law. Wholesalers gradually became little more than distributing agents, And the retailers' profit margins came under increasing pressure because manufacturers were more or less able to dictate to the retailer both his buying price and his selling price. And then, in the 1960s, the balance of power began to swing again.
And this time it was the turn of the retailers. They got new managements who recognized the profit opportunities. They themselves, the bigger ones, began to make use of economies of scale in buying, warehousing, store size and location, self-service. They started taking initiatives as entrepreneurs by branding their own goods, such as cheese, meat and vegetables, and by introducing new products such as delicatessen. And what, more than anything else, allowed this to happen was, of course, the ending of resale price maintenance. As price competition in the retail trade forced marginal, specialist, or just plain inefficient retailers out of business, retailing volume became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This is what happened to the grocery business in the 10 years between 1960 and 1970. Multiples and voluntary groups doing an ever-increasing share of the total business, independents fairly rapidly falling away. One immediate result of this concentration of power was that the strong growing retailers buying in huge quantities could exert much greater control over both buying and selling prices. For the second time in less than 100 years, a middleman became the dominant link in the production-distribution chain.
So, is today a return to the predicament that the manufacturer was in during the period of wholesaler domination in the late 19th century? Well, in many ways it would seem it is. It seems to us quite inevitable that during the 1970s, the retailers will consolidate even more. They'll have more mergers, and that will concentrate the buying power into even fewer hands than today. But the competition between those retailers is going to become more intense, and at the same time, other less conventional forms of retailing, such as cash and carries, discount stores, mail order, direct selling, all these will subject retailers' margins to even greater pressure. And on top of that, direct government intervention on retail prices is likely to become a permanent feature of life. Retailers are going to have no choice but to pass these pressures on to manufacturers, and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth brand in any market are going to find it increasingly difficult to hold distribution, let alone make any money. Sooner or later, of course, some natural balance will be restored. The public will demand more variety, and they'll be prepared to pay for it. The retailers themselves will recognize that they need strong national brands, even if they don't need very many of them. But very few manufacturers will be happy to sit it out, to wait for the balance to restore itself naturally. What they'll want to do is to take some action of their own.
The question is, can the principles by which the manufacturer broke away from wholesaler domination once before help him again in breaking away from retailer domination? Well, we believe they can. But this will mean a very different approach from the one that many manufacturers have adopted in recent years.
To date, many manufacturers have reacted to increased pressure from the retailer just by giving in to it. In order to sustain their sales volume, they've offered larger and larger discounts to the retailer. And what's more, they've often covered up this situation by allocating these special discounts to the marketing budget, as if they were a form of marketing expenditure like advertising or distribution or sales force cost or consumer promotions. Now, this may be an administrative convenience, but it's a false and it's potentially very dangerous way of regarding them, because in truth, these discounts aren't expenditure at all. They're income foregone. What they are is a recognition that the price the manufacturer can command from a big customer is less than he can from a small one, which in turn must mean that the brand, quite simply, is not valuable enough in the retailer's eyes. To him, it's just not worth its full price. And the bigger these special discounts are, the more they get taken for granted, the less and less valuable the brand becomes.
In other words, if the manufacturer withdraws funds from those very activities that are designed to increase the value of a brand and diverts them into discounts and retailer promotions, he'll go into a vicious spiral, and one that could be critically dangerous in the economic conditions of the 1970s. What we believe the manufacturer must do in today's circumstances is to apply, as he did in the 19th century, an indirect pressure on the retailer, and that pressure can come only from improved products and the manufacturer's relationship with the consumer.
Now, consumers in any competitive market have always had the last word. No manufacturer could hope to survive for long if he failed to satisfy them. But there is a difference today. People can exercise their choice more. They're much better informed, and much less of their income has to go on basic necessities. More important, perhaps, is the emergence of consumerism, and the difference this makes is very clear. In the past, the consumer always had the ultimate sanction, but but it was exercised individually and privately. Today, it can be exercised by groups and in public. In the past, if a manufacturer failed to satisfy consumers, they simply stopped buying his brand. Today, that's called a boycott. The newspapers take it up, and the individuals involved have a great sense of solidarity. And if it's a serious failure, and if the consumerist group is reasonably representative of the public as a whole, then it can be a very public failure with great repercussions, and quite right too. What this means for the manufacturer is that getting the right relationship with consumers is going to be more testing than before. And because of all these pressures, it's going to be a lot more important. But the principles involved remain exactly the same. If the manufacturer can make his brand more valuable to the consumer, then it's bound to be more valuable to the retailer. It won't have to be sold at a huge discount. And then the margins can be maintained, and so can the profits. All of which is easy enough to say. But how can the manufacturer do it? How can he make his brand more valuable to the consumer, and so sustain both demand and price? Well, to answer that question, it's necessary first to understand the anatomy of a brand. Just what is it that people like about brands? What do they value and respect? What do they feel comfortable with? What do they remain loyal to? What are they happy to pay a fair price for? What, in fact, are the needs and desires in people that a strong brand satisfies?
Well, every brand performs a function. It does something. And if it doesn't do it very well, or a competitor does it rather better, then it will very soon fail. So a successful brand is a brand that provides functional satisfaction. But is that all? Let's think for a moment just how we do actually choose things. Here we've got two tables. This one's a modern table, varnished wood, plastic laminate top. This one's an 18th century table made out of rosewood. Now, what functionally do we want of a table? Well, clearly we want it to have a flat surface for putting things on. We want it to be of a convenient height, convenient size, and steady on its feet. And if you take all those criteria, these two tables score equally well. We also, of course, want it to be, the table we buy, to be reasonably priced. You could get this table for £10.84, but if you wanted that one, you'd have to pay over 500 quid for it. And some people do buy tables like that, and they're very happy. They know exactly what they're doing. They're not deceived in any way. So the first primitive point we'd like to make is very, very few things we buy are bought entirely on function. We certainly want function, but we want function plus.
Yes, and it's this plus that makes all the difference between the different sorts of things we buy. I mean, if you take something even more apparently functional than tables, knives and forks. I mean, we get knives and forks to cut up our meat and veg and so on with. But when you choose between different brands of knife and different brands of fork, then it's all sorts of other aesthetic values, isn't it, that we take into account. Or we found something even more so, chimney pots, which you'd think were very functional. Chimney pots just take the smoke away. But we found a huge range of chimney pots with giving different pleasures, each one of them.
People. Yeah, in fact, it is extraordinarily difficult, we found, to think of anything which we buy entirely on function. And the closest we got to it, and maybe that's not perfect, is £1.50 pound of nails sold loose from an ironmonger. And that leads on to an interesting thought, because once you bought the nails, then you want something to knock them in with and pull them out with when you bent them, which means you need a hammer. And you go into your ironmonger's and you've decided that you want a 16-ounce hammer with a claw. Very functional, very rational. And as it happens, I have some hammers here. In the ironmonger, I'm faced with a choice. Two 16-ounce hammers, both with claws, both, no doubt, very functional, equally functional, both very good at banging in the nails and pulling them out again. But
these two.
Those are not equal hammers, because one is a very plain, straightforward man's hammer, one is a golfer's hammer, a hammer for a man who's already got three hammers. They're going to appeal to different people for non-functional reasons.
This is the one that says "my hammer" to me.
To you, yeah.
Or you could say the same about other things which are just as much instrumental. I mean, take these things, ballpoints. Now these two write more or less the same, equally well, but that one is a far more valuable object than that one, and it's nothing to do with function at all, to me. This is a very personal thing, of course, but there are a lot of things which are very public as well. I mean, take clothes, for instance. We all wear clothes to keep us warm and to keep us decent, but I can tell you I didn't buy this suit because it was the warmest one I could find, or the most decent one, whatever that means. I bought it because I suppose I like the style and the cut and the colour, and it didn't seem too expensive, and it was good cloth. And even there, I suspect that's a bit of a rationalisation, because what I really got it for, I expect, was to project myself to you and the outside world.
Thought you were.
Yes, it was my attempt at being individual in this grey world.
Well, you pulled it off, I think, very well. And take a further example of function. I mean, that, you could argue, is an object you couldn't get much more functional than, because if I didn't wear them, I couldn't see. But if I suddenly turned up one day wearing those, I think anybody would have to be extraordinarily naive or charitable to argue that I'd bought them for purely functional reasons.
But you would be able to find a very good reason for it to express to the rest of us. I'm sure you can succeed, Oscar. What we all of us do is buy things for emotional or aesthetic motives, and then we rationalize them afterwards because we've been brought up to believe that's proper. And this is rather like the man in the car. This was a very honest story told to us about himself by a marketing man. He wanted a new car, and he wanted to choose it very carefully and very rationally. He was that sort of man. So he calculated his average annual mileage and the price of petrol. He took into account rising maintenance costs, the availability of public transport, the size of his family. And from all these data, he was able to compute a precise specification for his ideal car. And then he looked at the brochures and the ads in the hope of finding it. And quite soon, he saw an advertisement that looked a bit like this. And the moment he saw it, he fell in love with it. Without knowing one single fact about it, he knew that this was his car. Desperately, his eyes raced through the copy, and he found just what he was looking for. 14 cubic feet of luggage space, it said. Aha, he thought, 14 cubic feet of luggage space, just what I was looking for. I knew I was a rational man, and he bought the car, and as far as I know, is extremely happy with it. So, while I need a car to take me from A to B, a table to eat off, a hammer to knock in nails with, I'm going to choose between cars and tables and hammers more often than not for entirely non-functional reasons, and so will everyone else. And what's true of clothes and tables and cars and hammers is equally true for washing powders and soap and pet foods and packaged cakes and even toilet paper. Let's look now at the history of the toilet paper market and consider the relative fortunes of Bowater Scott's Andrex and Kimberly-Clark's Delsey. Because this is a market typical of many today. A great deal of price cutting, many new minor brands introduced, and a lot of retailers' brands. It's the sort of near commodity market where private label thrives best. It's also a market which depends heavily on grocery distribution, and that's where retailer buying power is at its strongest. From the middle 1950s onwards, Andrex and Delsey between them steadily built up the soft paper segment of this market. They were competing with the old type of hard paper that was so much part of our proud heritage. Andrex led the way, but Delsey wasn't all that far behind. By 1962, they'd made good progress. Andrex had reached 22% of the market, which was enough to make it market leader, and Delsey was quite close at 16%. They'd done well enough by now to tempt in other manufacturers. By 1964, these other brands of soft paper had grown rapidly enough to provide a real threat to Bowater Scott and Kimberly-Clark. And no less of a threat was the growing pressure from retailers which accompanied these smaller, cheaper brands. But from 1964 onwards, the two major manufacturers diverged very markedly in their response to these pressures. Up to 1964, Andrex, Delsey, and the other brands invested money fairly steadily in media advertising, reaching about £600,000 in total in that year. In the early years, Delsey outspent Andrex, but the balance gradually changed. Then, as this pressure from retailers increased, the manufacturers started cutting this expenditure. They found it necessary, in fact, to dip into their marketing budgets in order to fund promotions, or rather, as we suggested earlier, in order to fund price cutting. And in fact, the retail price of toilet paper did actually go down during the second half of the 1960s. So the manufacturers' margins decreased, and they made up for it by cutting their marketing budgets. But look at the difference in behavior between Andrex and Delsey. By the end of 1964, Delsey had virtually given up trying to speak directly to the consumer through advertising and was concentrating almost entirely on discounting. Andrex, on the other hand, kept up a balance between the two. By 1966, you can see Delsey had stopped media advertising altogether, and by 1969, Andrex was the only toilet paper advertiser left. The results of these policies were quite dramatic. The minor, cheaper brands of soft toilet paper continued to gain share rapidly. Andrex, though a little less rapidly, also continued to grow. Delsey slipped back a lot. But in a sense, this doesn't tell the whole story, because here we're looking at volume figures. Much more significantly, by 1969, Andrex had reached a share of market value of 30%. Delsey was down to 10%, and since then it's slipped much further. What this means is that Andrex was able to build up its market share without having to sell at a cut price. Throughout the whole of this period, it was valued by consumers and by retailers at a price which gave Bowater Scott a reasonable margin and a fair return. And of course it goes further than that. because it's only through the sort of profits that Andrex made then that the company could afford to invest in new plant, in research and development, improved products and new brands. That is, it could afford to plan for good value for consumers in the future. Now, why did this happen? To say that Andrex succeeded simply because they advertised, we think is to miss the real point. And the real point is, what happened inside consumers' minds during this period? Why did they buy more Andrex and less Delsey? Well, to get some idea of this, we have to look at the findings of the Advertising Planning Index. This chart shows the proportion of housewives who attributed the qualities of softness and strength to Andrex, that's in the yellow, and Delsey in orange, and how their views changed between 1964 and 1969. Up to 1966, you can see the two brands were advancing at very much the same rate. But after that, Andrex continued to go ahead, and Delsey dropped right back on both attributes. Now, we must make 2 points on these findings. First of all, looked at objectively, the physical standards of these two products have always been very close. They've always both been of extremely high quality, and there weren't any marked changes of product in this period. Secondly, we're not suggesting that people suddenly thought to themselves, "Aha, Delsey isn't as soft as it was." What did happen was that, compared with Andrex, people simply came to value Delsey less highly than they did as a brand. And these words, softness and strength, are simply their way of expressing a higher total regard for Andrex than for Delsey. In other words, despite very similar physical characteristics, Andrex became worth more than Delsey to consumers. But if that extra value didn't come purely from the physical product, where did it come from? Well, quite clearly, as with every successful brand, it came from a blend of a lot of things. First of all, of course, Andrex's very high product quality and its consistently high product quality over many years, its efficient marketing, its early leadership in the soft toilet paper market, its willingness to innovate with new colors, with product improvements, packaging improvements. In general, Andrex, you see, has taken the positive approach and it's benefited from it. But the added values, the factor that allowed Andrex to command a proper price, most certainly depend a great deal also on the fact that it maintained a direct contact with consumers through advertising, and indeed on the way in which the company has used its advertising. Or, to broaden that a little bit, on the consistent way in which Andrex and all its values have been presented to the public as a totality, as a brand. Andrex, in people's minds, is much more than an object, more than a product. It's not just any old roll of toilet paper. It has a very clear identity. Or, if we can use an analogy that we found extremely helpful, it's got a distinct and very favorable personality of its own. And it's here we think that the difference lies. Let's look now at some of the advertising that's appeared for Andrex over the years. And as you look at it, you'll see that superficially it varies quite a lot. But look also for the common factors.
Probably like new Andrex because it's beautifully soft and very strong. But there's another reason for liking new Andrex. There's much more of it. In fact, it gives you more paper on every roll than almost any other tissue. New Andrex. It goes a long, long way.
Well, what are the common factors? There's no unique product claim, no unique feature or functional description. But there is a consistency of attitude and of tone of voice. And these belong to Andrex, are a part of Andrex, just as the colors and the packaging are. Andrex, the brand, emerges with a clear identity or personality. It emerges, for example, as being feminine, not it, but she. And this personality is a blend of functional attributes, softness, strength, value for money, and non-functional attributes, style and aesthetic appearance. So that Andrex emerges as modern, a person of today. She's reliable, dainty, clean living, domesticated, family-centered, radiating confidence in her ability to manage. It's all these things, as well as the functional qualities, that go to make Andrex, as it were, a nice person to have about the house. Without advertising, people would have had far fewer clues to the nature of Andrex, and their regard for it would inevitably have diminished. Now, some people still feel that to talk of a product, an object, a roll of toilet tissue as having a personality, even as an analogy, is fanciful. It's just typical communications talk, and it's unrelated both to the real world or to profit. And yet another lot of people feel that to value an object for non-functional reasons is somehow foolish or wicked or certainly unrespectable. Yet, of course, we all do, we always will, and we should either stop either pretending we don't or wishing we didn't.
Yes, well, happily, consumers know a great deal more about brands than manufacturers do or advertising agencies do, and they don't seem to have any of these intellectual hang-ups at all. We find that, haven't we, that they can and they do see brands as personalities, and they find it perfectly easy to talk about brands in people terms.
Well, we'd like to show you now, in fact, a few perfectly ordinary people talking. They weren't specially selected, they weren't briefed, they'd no idea what they were going to be asked. And what they were asked could have struck them as absurd and silly, irrelevant, just plain daft. But it didn't. The question was this: if this particular brand were a person, what sort of person would it be?
Okay, how would you, if you thought of Fairy Snow is coming to life, what kind of a person would you think Fairy Snow would be?
Well, I would think it would be somebody older who was very sort of set in the way of sort of soap, and it's got to be, you know, all rubbed and the rubbing board and all this sort of thing, you know. And somebody whose outlook on life was a little slower.
Yes.
Most probably her children would be growing up. She'd be a married woman again, I should imagine. Well, just sort of generally doing a slower run of life than would Mrs. Ariel.
Yes, tell me more about Mrs. Ariel now.
Well, you know, I think she'd be the sort of person that would want to get everything done, though very well and very efficiently, to have rather a good social life at the same time, you know, sort of very sparkling, and would be, you know, the sort who would always have a babysitter at the ready to go out in the evening and take good care of herself and like to sort of keep young and follow
what would
the trends.
Mrs. Fairy Snow do in the evening?
Most probably sit by the fire and watch television.
Mrs. Ariel would probably be just that little bit more, you know, experimenting, taking a chance, trying something new. Mr. Surf, probably a single, older man. Mr. Surf would be carpenter, bricklayer, something like that. He'd probably have a car, an old banger.
And Surf?
Very placid indeed, bovine.
And what about Tide? What sort of personality would Tide have?
A very gruff old man, very fierce, ex-army type.
What about Tide, if Tide became a person?
Oh, well, it's a little nearer. Mrs. Ariel's sort of person. She would be more, little more with it, more mini-skirted, more Americanized, I would think, the sort of person who tends to buy the frozen foods and have rather a flashy car. It matters to her, conventional, you know, social things matter to her, I would think, rather than with Mrs. Surf. I don't think she matters too much if she doesn't keep up with the Joneses.
No. Purcell, I think, always reminds me of children. I presume it's the advert, but some child of about 6 or 7, probably got a brother, little girl, probably got a brother. Very happy children. They fight occasionally, but it's peaceful. The peaceful childhood reminds me.
What about Lifebuoy, if that became a person?
It's an older man, around about 50-ish. Somebody whose children are growing up, got a very steady job and looking to retirement.
Little lad, blonde hair, full of mischief.
What age is that?
8. Rough nut.
I think of a sort of sporty type of man who is sort of always on the tennis courts.
A male worker in his 20s, dirty job, mining or something.
What would he be like as a neighbour?
Oh, I should think he'd be very good, but people might take him wrongly because he was so abrupt. But underneath it all, he was kind-hearted.
What about Camay toilet soap as a person?
Oh, a fresh, bright young girl of about 18 or 19. Very bright and very clean. She likes to wash her hair at least twice a week. And of course has a bath every day and looks after herself and her bedroom. Very tidy.
Camay, a lovely young girl. Like my daughter. Long-haired. Very well scrubbed. Dainty.
Or single person, a model, I would think. You know, very tall and very slim, and very, very careful about her makeup and the toilet things she used.
What sort of boyfriends would she have if she's single?
Oh, I should think very go-ahead boyfriends, you know, sort of salesmen and, you know, people like this.
She might be a bit like that to everybody and sort of underneath a bit catty, perhaps, but she's warm to everyone. But secretly she might be thinking differently about you.
What would she be like as a neighbour? A neighbour? Oh, I think she'd be terribly hard to live next door to. What about Nora Soups?
Nora Soups,
Nora became a person. What would Nora be like as a person?
Oh, a tall, fair girl. Probably the name Nora, Scandinavian sounding. With some kids in a pram, I can see.
Oh, a mum again. Not a young person. 45, 50.
Sort of mid-European type businessman. I don't know why.
I would think a fairly young mother from 20 onwards.
What about Heinz, if that became a person?
Oh, she's rather like Mrs. Purcell.
Oh, I think the older person. By older I mean 60, 65. A woman who hasn't got a lot of money. Perhaps pensioner. Oh, very sweet. Very understanding. It was a little bit narrow.
What about bachelors?
Yes, what about bachelors? Oh, soup.
From all the experimental research we've done on this, it does seem pretty clear that the most successful brands do have recognizable personalities, and that those personalities tend to be consistent. But as with people, the same personality can be liked or disliked according to the person in whose mind the image forms. Let's take an extreme example of this, Sir Winston Churchill, who is by any standards a very distinct personality. The nature of his personality will differ according to who it is that's thinking about him. In the 1940s, for instance, to his people and his allies, no doubt he seemed something like this. And to his enemies, he probably seemed like this. In just the same way, there are elements of apparent diversity of reputation in brands. For instance, we found that Persil is seen by some people as happy and contented, by others as dull and lacking in ambition. Tide, however, was thought alert and ambitious by some, brash and aggressive by others. But there isn't any real contradiction here. These aren't two different personalities for each of those brands. It's the same personality, simply seen from two different viewpoints.
It's not always easy to trace the sources of a brand's personality. Here it's some physical element of the product, there the name and packaging, somewhere else the price, or the kind of shop you find it in, or the advertising. But beyond any doubt at all, the personality is clearest and strongest when all the clues are consistent one with another. If distribution, price, nature of product, packaging, advertising, promotions do not conflict with one another, if they all unite to form a coherent and consistent totality, then a product is more than a product. It begins to satisfy needs over and above purely functional needs. And if it does that, then it's worth more money.
So, to go back to what we said we'd do, first, is there anything that we can learn from the history of brands that can help us in the future? And the answer seems to be yes. As before, success lies in two things. First, unique brands, and secondly, the direct communication between the manufacturer and the consumer. And communication, of course, means listening as well as talking. Secondly, we asked, what really makes a brand successful, and successful over a significant period of time? And the answer here seems to be that the successful brand is not just a functional thing, nor even a consistent blend of functional and non-functional things, but it's a unique blend. It offers in total something that no other brand can, no other brand does. And we believe that in future, the recognition that non-functional values can be at least as important as functional ones is going to become more and more accepted and more necessary. And thirdly, we said we'd try to answer the question, what is the role that advertising can and should play?
To get us thinking not just about advertising in a vague theoretical way, but about real advertisements, let's look at some. We're going to use only commercials made by this company for our clients. not because we claim any monopoly of good advertising, nor because they necessarily illustrate our arguments any better than many others might have done. It's just that we know the background, we know what they're trying to do, and in many cases can be reasonably certain they've done it. And we'd like to thank those clients who've agreed to our talking about their advertising.
We don't approve of dinner parties where the girls have to leave the men to their port. Melissa loathes them, especially as it means missing out on the after aid. Cool, creamy peppermint, rich, dark chocolate, a very slim shape. This house believes in equality. After aid for everyone.
In 1760, just after this house was built, Louis Berger was founding a paint company in London. Today, these beautiful walls are getting a coat of a completely new kind of wall paint from Berger's company, Magicoat Vinyl. It goes on easily as emulsion. Look at that. And you wash your brushes in water, but it dries to a real silky finish, sealed with a tough vinyl resin. Well, there's real protection here. And when your visitors have been and gone, even bad marks can be wiped away. Magicoat Vinyl. Not gloss, not a matte emulsion. An entirely new kind of paint. From Berger.
Smarty people are happy people. They smile all the time because they're feeling fine. Because it's Smarty time. Smarty people make funny faces, clap their hands. They're Smarty fans, they know the taste is grand. Come on, join in with the Smarty band. What a lot I've got, Smarties.
These are the champions. The champion dirt collectors. If you own a champion, we've made you something new. A new kind of Persil. It's still a soap powder, but far more effective. Look, new Persil has the power to get deep down to this kind of real ground-in dirt, and very, very thoroughly, but gently, float it away. So things can come out beautifully white and beautifully soft, too. New Persil. Shows a dirt collector it can't take care of.
When Mr. Kipling makes almond slices, he sticks to the old traditional ways. Light short crust pastry, covered with raspberry jam. Then his own delicious rich paste, sprinkled with chopped almonds. That's the way to make real almond slices, says Mr. Kipling. He must be right. He does make exceedingly good cakes.
Kodak announced their new Pocket Instamatic camera. A camera so small that Kodak had to invent a new film to make it possible. The film is in a simple, easy-to-load cartridge. And time,
Mom!
after time, it gives you full-size color prints. It's a beautiful little camera you can have with you always. The new Pocket Instamatic camera from Kodak.
Yeah. What's that in there, then?
Well, I don't know. You got your hand over the label.
Oh, smell it.
Beer. It's a bottle of beer.
Shut your eyes. What? Shut your eyes. What are you doing? Pouring it out for you.
Oh, come on. Stop messing about with it.
There you are. You drink that. Well?
Yeah, it's all right, that. No bad drop of beer, that. Guinness? I don't like Guinness.
Some very different products there with different functions and appealing to many, many different kinds of people. But there are, we believe, in all those commercials, certain common factors. First, they don't concentrate exclusively on function, nor exclusively on what is often called emotional appeal. There's sometimes a tendency to think that advertising must be either USP or brand image. that you've got to choose between verbal claims of functional superiority or attractive, moody associations, between, as it's often put, hard sell and soft sell. Now, we're totally opposed to this kind of polarization. We believe good brand advertising, more often than not, contributes to the blend of appeals to the senses, the reason, and the emotions. Take the Smarties commercial. That communicates quantity and value for money, and gaiety, fun, wit, enjoyment. There's no conflict. Reason and emotion blend. The Kodak commercial communicates simplicity and ease of use, and the emotions that picture taking involve. The Magicoat commercial communicates hard facts about the nature of vinyl and appeal to the reason. It communicates through sight and touch the nature of the finish it gives, which is an appeal to the senses. And it provides reassurances of quality, both through the company behind the paint and the sort of house it's being seen used in. And these, obviously, are primarily appeals to the emotions. In all cases, a blend, and a coherent blend. And in each case, we believe that because of this, the commercials express and they synthesize the brand's total personality. Now, a second common factor. Each commercial represents a campaign, and that's to say a long-term expression of a consistent set of values. In the case of Percival and Smarties, for example, very much the same values have been associated with the brands for 10 years or more. Details of expression have changed, of course, but at root, Smarties advertising in 1973 has the same character, the same balance of rational and emotional appeals as it had in 1960. And it's these values which spring from the physical nature of the product that advertising can not only synthesize but enhance. So the product becomes more valuable in the minds of its consumers.
And as we said earlier, if a brand becomes more valuable to consumers, then it's more valuable to the retailer. He doesn't feel the need to make it a cut-price brand. And if it can retain its margins, then it can continue to be profitable. So, 6 final points as a summary. 1, like it or not, we're into a period of much greater power for the retailer, and that power is unlikely in the short term to decline naturally. The successful manufacturer will be the one who can make the best of it. 2, success for manufacturers in the future is going to depend much more than in the past on holding on to margins, and very much less on sheer size and growth. 3, the only way to build and sustain margins will be by developing brands that are competitively more valuable to consumers. And that means taking the positive approach, having a good product, having frequent brand improvements, and it means making a direct and a consistent communication between manufacturer and ultimate consumer. That means listening to consumers as well as talking to them. 4, the aspects of a brand that make it valuable to people are increasingly likely to be non-functional values of style and personality. But they're going to be important to people only if they complement the brand's physical and functional advantages, because neither will there be enough alone. 5, advertising has a crucial and a changing role to play. Of course, it will always have a role in increasing volume sales, but its main task in the future will more often be to add values and so to sustain profits. And not only will advertising in itself be an important element within those added values, but it will be the primary means of expressing the whole personality of the brand. And finally, when we say added values, we really do mean added values, not values in place of performance or in place of function or in place of value for money. Any manufacturer who fails to provide those functional satisfactions is going to be just as unsuccessful in the future as he's always been in the past. At the same time, any manufacturer who fails to recognize the importance to the consumer of certain non-functional satisfactions will be failing to realize both the real nature and the real worth of the brand that he sells.